I'm going to be talking to Professor Shane Gunster, who's at the School of Communications, Simon Fraser University, about a new paper called Our Oil, Extractive, Populism in Canadian Social Media. It's all about how the Canadian oil industry and its boosters have been trying to control and influence the narrative around oil and gas in Canada for the last number of years. So welcome to the interview, Shane.
Markham, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Look, I'm really excited to talk to you about this because what you're talking about is the debate on social media, primarily probably Twitter and Facebook, around where oil and gas is going in this country, and generally, particularly in the energy transition. I've been involved in that conversation for 10 years. The organizations that you talk about in your paper are ones that I've engaged with, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. So let's start with maybe an overview of your paper, please.
Sure. So the research was part of a larger project that called the Corporate Mapping Project that is looking or designed to look at how industry influences policymaking and the evolution of public opinion on oil and gas, on climate, on environmental issues, on energy, and so on. And we noticed that there seemed to be a shift around 2014, 2015 in terms of industry's approach to those objectives. So the shift involved moving away, or supplementing is probably a better way of putting it, supplementing a more traditional public relations model of trying to influence public opinion that primarily relies upon large mass media advertising campaigns, on information subsidies to influence journalism, and on community sponsorships and partnerships in communities. Instead, to a model that you might describe as a kind of movement-based model of influencing public opinion that targets key constituencies and tries to subsidize them to become industry champions and spread pro-industry messages in their social networks, and in particular uses new media channels, social media being the most obvious, to spread that message far and wide.
And I'm very interested in why you called it extractive populism, because populism is essentially based around the idea that a particular group, usually a group of citizens, like in a province like Alberta or in Canada, in a country, and they're under attack and
right.
from outside. And so
right.
the political leaders wrap themselves in this nationalism, and they, very simple kinds of messaging. And you see that now in Alberta with Jason Kenney, you see it at the federal level with the Conservative Party. You see it with Trump, would be the best example in the US.
Right.
And I would agree with you that in 2015, that is the pivotal year that there was this switch to this more populist approach to messaging and using social media.
Right. Yeah, no. So we came up with this idea of calling it extractive populism because we found that it was an attempt to try and build these debates and discussions around oil and gas and merge them with this sort of broader populist narrative that you just talked about. And we identified in particular 3 elements of that narrative. So the first element is the argument that the oil and gas industry is a public good, that it's operated primarily to benefit all Canadians through employment opportunities, through economic growth, through tax revenue for governments. There was some advertising at the time from the Alberta provincial government, the NDP at that time, that was literally suggesting that the oil and gas industry is basically run to build schools and hospitals. In contrast, of course, the oil and gas industry, as you and I know, it's run by corporations primarily for the benefit of shareholders, and there have been declining levels of employment and tax revenue. So somewhat challenging that particular claim. The second element of extractive populism is that the oil and gas industry is under attack by a small but powerful liberal elite, which really fits into populist narratives. So this is the foreign-funded radicals argument that really had been circulating in Alberta for at least a decade, and then it was kind of nationalized by Joe Oliver with his foreign-funded radicals open letter, which I think was published in media, and then was given a lot of traction by Vivian Krause and columnists in Postmedia papers and so on. And again, this really isn't true at all. As you know, and I think you've even done some reporting on that, opposition to fossil fuel expansion in Canada is primarily led by Canadians, often First Nations, local communities, environmental groups. That are worried about the harm that industry is doing. And I think there was a recent report, and I think you might have had him on your show, by Gord Laxer, which talks about how if you really want to get into foreign funding influence, it's more prevalent in the oil and gas industry side than it is on the environmental side. So that's the second claim. And the third claim of extractive populism is that the oil and gas industry is helpless to defend itself, and it requires the active political mobilization of ordinary Canadians to defend and to save it. Again, in contrast to that, the oil and gas industry continues to exercise a lot of economic and political power. It's got an extensive lobbying infrastructure in place to influence federal and provincial governments, and it has powerful allies in the financial sector.
And there are a couple of stories. I mean, I could tell you many stories to illustrate this point, but here's a couple. From very early on, 2014, 2015, when the oil sands CEOs were engaging in the discussion with NGOs, and with environmental groups, and with the NDP government of Rachel Notley about a climate plan, the one thing that they wanted above all else is we'll agree to carbon pricing, we'll agree to a lot, but we will not agree to reductions in production.
Right.
And the growth. And you see that today. It was only just last week, Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who's seen as a Greenpeace activist and enemy of the industry, said, when we bring in the oil and gas cap, emissions cap, it will not include restrictions on production. Production can continue to grow. There is the industry agenda right out in front, and with governments agreeing with it. So anyway, just an illustration of what you're saying.
Right. Yes. No, absolutely. I think one of the things that we're seeing now or that will be interesting to watch now is it feels to me like and again, you would know more about this than I in some ways, but barely a week goes by where we don't get new research that talks about the need to openly think about winding down the fossil fuel industry in order to confront the serious problem of climate change, at least in terms of dealing with emissions from that industry. Canadian media, mainstream media, has largely been silent on that, or has largely avoided really talking about that. And I think part of it comes back to the success of industry in positioning the oil and gas industry as absolutely central to the Canadian economy. There's no question that it plays an important role, but I suspect if you ask most people, well, how important actually is it? How many people actually work in it? Are those numbers of people going up or going down? They would not necessarily have an accurate understanding of the impact of industry. They'd have an oversized understanding of the impact of industry, in part because of how effective industry has been with these various campaigns.
Right. And I should point out to viewers that Energy Media has taken a very strong editorial position on this. It's a little different than what you were describing. Our position has 3 points. One is it's absolutely essential that oil and gas be decarbonized. Number 2 is that there has to be a post combustion strategy. So you start making materials with oil and gas as opposed to making fuels that'll be burned. And also that oil and gas has to properly fund its environmental liabilities cleanup. Right. So those kind of 3 things. And the reason I bring this up is because we're kind of a middle ground. We're a third position in this. Right. And one of the things that this sort of extractive populism does is it tends to polarize the conversation, and it excludes other, innovative, different ideas. That it excludes it from the conversation. And I think at the end of the day, that's the greatest the disservice that this approach does to Canada and to Canadians is that it posits a false binary. It's either get rid of them or they're the greatest thing on the world. In the world, it takes away those other options that we really should be talking about.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I am not an energy economist. I'm not really particularly an expert on those questions about the extent to which industry can actually decarbonize in terms of removing emissions. I think those possibilities should certainly be part of the mix. the caution I would express is that industry has, in particular with carbon capture and storage, used that as a kind of excuse, I think, to engage with, to confront these sort of bigger questions about what sort of role the oil and gas industry can continue to play in a 1.5 degree world, or a world which is on target to achieve those emissions reductions. If it's actually possible, let's talk about it. However, I would just be cautious in terms of the sort of PR function of that, because carbon capture and storage has been, on the agenda for a long time. I don't know that we've really seen the concrete practical evidence of its success. And of course, you just have to look south of the border at the way clean coal, the way that campaign was used for a long time to suggest, well, hey, coal can continue to be part of the mix, when I think most of the evidence suggests it probably can't.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is that there's a big debate to be had around CCUS, but what the industry has done very cleverly is they've plugged CCUS into the existing extractive populist narrative. And so suddenly
Right.
CCUS becomes part of this, rah, 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 wrap yourself in the flag kind of a approach to
Right.
communications.
Right.
And all of the work that the industry has done over the last, let's say, 15 years, you can see now it bearing fruit, because
Right.
it has this stranglehold on the Canadian energy conversation. And when it wants to put its position out there, it mobilizes this network you're talking about, and
Yes.
and boom, and
Yes.
right away it exerts undue influence on the conversation.
Yes, and one thing too, I would also add to the mix is we have, particularly in terms of print media, we have terrible print media when it comes to energy journalism. Again, something I don't have to tell you about, but the way in which Postmedia really has served as a kind of handmaiden, to use a terrible analogy perhaps, to industry narratives over the years. And it's really done Canada a huge disservice in terms of actually providing Canadians with different perspectives on the impact of the fossil fuel industry on emissions, on the future of the fossil fuel industry in a kind of carbon constrained world. Recently, for example, I was doing some research on the last Canadian election, and we really had a kind of narrative that was focused almost exclusively upon the reduction of domestic emissions, and that really didn't look so much at the supply side issues in terms of the fossil fuel sector. And part of that is, I think, because Postmedia exercises this kind of stranglehold over print media in English Canada, and it sees itself as kind of almost an accomplice to industry narratives in that regard.
Well, let's talk about some of the organizations that are involved. You studied 7 of them. Some
Right.
of them are industry led. So the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has got the Energy Citizen campaign. But there's a couple that are what I would call AstroTurf organizations. That's Cody Battershill's the Canada Action, I think it is, and then Robbie Picard from Fort McMurray, his Canada Strong or Oil Strong, something like that. Yeah. Anyway, and those, I mean, we know now that Battershill, his organization has received $100,000 and more of money from oil and gas companies or oil and gas. I mean, it's a very clever way for the industry to fund its narrative work without actually being seen to fund it.
Yeah. No, I think so in the paper, we offer a somewhat different model for thinking about what these organizations are doing. The problem I have with simply describing them as AstroTurf is I think that most people think AstroTurf means that you have 4 people in a boardroom and they come up with this idea of how to misrepresent what the public actually wants about something, or a large group of people actually want about something. And that's why it's called AstroTurf, right, as a play on grassroots. Instead, the model that we used to talk about this was subsidized publics. So it's similar in the sense that industry is providing resources and ideas and infrastructure and influence to give a particular slice of the public an oversized role in debates about whatever the particular issue is. And that's slightly different in the sense that it doesn't say that there's nobody who actually believes this, which is what I think the connotation of AstroTurf is, that this is purely a sort of top-down, corporate orchestrated, made up out of thin air kind of idea. And as compared to the subsidized public's view, which says, no, this is actually corporations just giving particular communities, particular individuals with a particular political philosophy or a particular perspective on an issue, the resources to have a much bigger role in the public sphere. And I think at a certain level, that's exactly what Cody Battershill and Robbie Picard have done quite successfully. The kind of engagement that they are able to produce and attract on Facebook isn't made up. Right? It's not like these are all bots and there's nobody behind that. They are actually really effective at engaging particular constituencies and giving them these sort of little factoids, which are half true and often exaggerations, but they're drawn from something, and giving them a worldview and giving them a platform, an oversized platform. And they're using industry resources, as you say, to do that. But that doesn't mean that nobody actually believes that, right? That's where I'd have a slight difference. And we only have to look at 2016 and Trump and 2016 and Brexit, and even the kind of surprising popularity, I think, of this so-called Freedom Convoy, to say that there are actually constituencies in Canada that do find this worldview, this messaging resonates with their own particular ideas and their own particular perspectives. What these groups do then is give that a much bigger significance than it deserves, right? And what we don't end up seeing is from other constituencies, other parts of the country, other people who have opposing perspectives, because they're not getting the same kind of subsidies. But that's why I really like the subsidies model as compared to just the AstroTurf model. So maybe we can agree to combine the two of them.
No, I actually like your explanation better. AstroTurf is kind of a lazy, I'll admit, kind of a lazy construct. It's used by folks like me sometimes a little lazily. So I like your idea better, and you will use that going forward. But Shane, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks very much, Markham. It was a pleasure to chat with you today.